The stethoscope was
Halt!
cold
Stay where
against
you
Martin
are!
Weber's chest. Captain James
Back up,
Morrison
no
pressed
closer.
it to 3 different points along the boy's ribcage,
No talking
listening
in the
for
line!
something that made sense.
Face forward and
Something
stand
that could
still!
explain why an 18-year-old prisoner of war
The
was
rendezvous is
still
compromised.
conscious,
Move to the
still
secondary
breathing,
location now.
still
Yes,
somehow
go.
alive.
We'll cover you.
The
Understood.
sound that
Moving
came
out.
back through the stethoscope was wrong. Completely wrong. The left lung whispered normally, air moving in and out like wind through prairie grass. But the right lung crackled and wheezed like wet paper being slowly torn apart. Morrison had heard this sound before. Twice. Both times the patient had died within 36 hours. But this boy was standing. Barely. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the examination table. His breathing was shallow, careful, like every inhale was a negotiation with death. 28 breaths per minute. Normal was 12 to 16. This boy's body was screaming for oxygen it couldn't get. Morrison lifted the stethoscope and looked at the prisoner's face. Pale, gaunt, eyes sunken deep into the skull. The color of old newspaper left too long in the rain. He had seen hundreds of German prisoners in the 6 months since taking this posting at the Missouri camp. Young men and old men, officers and enlisted, some cocky, some terrified, most just exhausted and grateful the fighting was done. They arrived dirty but stable, underfed but walking. Human beings who had simply been on the wrong side of history. This boy was different. Morrison switched to German. His accent was terrible, learned from a phrase book and sharpened through 6 months of medical interviews. But the words were clear enough. When did this happen? The boy's lips moved. One word. So quiet, Morrison almost missed it. Transport. Transport. For 3 weeks at sea from France to New York. Then another week by train to Missouri. 4 weeks traveling with a punctured lung. 4 weeks of every breath being a small miracle. 4 weeks of pain that should have killed him somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Morrison stepped back and looked at the intake form. Name, Weber, Martin, age, 18, height, 5'9", weight. He read the number twice because it didn't make sense. 112 pounds. Morrison had weighed sacks of grain heavier than this boy. He did the math in his head. At 5'9", Martin should weigh at least 150 pounds. Probably more at 18 when the body was still filling out into manhood. That meant 38 pounds of missing body mass. Not just fat, muscle, bone density, organ function. This wasn't simple malnutrition. This was a body that had been eating itself to stay alive. Morrison lifted Martin's shirt higher and stopped. Scars, dozens of them, thin white lines running horizontal across the boy's back and ribs. Some old, maybe a year or more, faded into the skin like ancient roads on a map. Others fresh, still pink and healing, still angry. These weren't combat wounds. Combat wounds were random. Shrapnel patterns, bullet holes. These scars were deliberate, organized, methodical. Morrison knew what they were. He had seen them once before on a sailor who had been flogged by a sadistic officer aboard a merchant vessel. But that was 1920s maritime brutality. This was 1944. This was supposed to be civilized warfare. He looked at Martin's face again. The boy's eyes were fixed on the floor. Not defiant, not ashamed, just empty. Morrison called for the interpreter. Corporal Heinrich Muller, German-American, born in Milwaukee to immigrant parents, spoke both languages like he was born twice. He arrived within 2 minutes, took one look at Martin, and his face went still. Sir, ask him where the scars came from. Muller spoke in German, soft, careful. The northern dialect that working-class families in the Ruhr Valley spoke. Martin listened, then answered. His voice was barely louder than breath. Muller translated. The scars are from beatings, not during combat, not during capture, during detention. He was held in a temporary camp in France for 2 months before being sent here. Overcrowded, undersupplied, guards who treated prisoners like cargo. Food was irregular. Discipline was violent. When he asked for medical attention after being struck in the chest during a punishment lineup, he was told to shut up and keep moving. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's when the rib cracked, Muller asked. Martin nodded once. And the lung, another nod. Morrison looked at the boy again, really looked at him. 18 years old, born in 1926, the year Babe Ruth hit his 60th home run, the year Houdini died, the year America still believed the good times would last forever. This boy had grown up in the shadow of the Third Reich, had been taught to hate, had been taught to fight, had been taught that America was the enemy of everything good and pure in the world. And then he had been captured and sent to France, and beaten and starved, and left to die slowly in a camp run by the very people who were supposed to be on the side of civilization. Morrison made his decision in less than 5 seconds. He picked up the phone on the wall and dialed the camp hospital. "I need an immediate transfer. Emergency. Probable hemothorax with spontaneous pneumothorax. Patient is 18 years old and has maybe 48 hours before complete lung collapse. Get me a bed and get me a chest tube kit." He hung up and turned to Mueller. "Tell him we're moving him to the hospital. Tell him we're going to fix this. And tell him that whatever happened to him in France is over." "He's in America now," Mueller translated. Martin's eyes flickered up to Morrison's face for the first time. There was no gratitude there, no relief, just confusion. Like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Like he was waiting for the trap to spring shut. Morrison understood. Trust was a luxury this boy could no longer afford. 2 guards brought a stretcher. They lifted Martin carefully like he was made of glass and carried him out of the intake building into the November afternoon. Other prisoners watched from behind the chain-link fence. Some recognized the look on Martin's face. They had seen it before in field hospitals and transport trains and the moments before a body gave up. But Martin was still breathing. Barely, but breathing. The camp hospital was a converted warehouse. 10 beds, basic surgical equipment, a small staff of military physicians and nurses who rotated through POW duty. Most of them resented the assignment. Morrison had learned to be grateful. He had seen enough death in the Pacific before his transfer. Fixing broken bodies was better than making them. Martin was placed on a bed near the back window where the afternoon light came in golden and clean. Morrison began the full examination. Pulse, 104 beats per minute. Weak and thready. Blood pressure, 90/60, dangerously low for someone still conscious. Temperature, normal. No infection yet. That was the only piece of good news. Morrison ordered an X-ray. The machine was portable, clumsy, used mostly for broken bones and shrapnel removal. But it would work. The image took 20 minutes to develop. When Morrison held it up to the light, he saw exactly what he had feared. The right lung had collapsed by approximately 30%. There was fluid in the pleural space. Dark shadows that meant blood and air were mixing together in a space that should have been vacuum sealed. Hemopneumothorax. Left untreated, the pressure would continue building. The lung would collapse further, and somewhere between 12 and 48 hours from now, Martin Weber would suffocate from the inside out. Morrison had performed this procedure exactly twice before in his career. Once on a sailor who had been stabbed in a bar fight in San Diego. Once on a Marine who had taken shrapnel out of Guadalcanal. Both had survived. Barely. He prepped the equipment, a long, hollow needle, 15 centimeters of surgical steel designed to puncture through the rib cage into the pleural space. If he went too deep, he would puncture the lung again. If he didn't go deep enough, he wouldn't reach the fluid. The margin for error was 2 millimeters, maybe 3. Mueller stayed to interpret. Morrison explained what was about to happen. Every step, every risk, every reason why this was necessary. Martin listened. His eyes never left the needle. "Is this going to hurt?" Morrison paused. He could lie. He could say no. He could tell Martin that the local anesthetic would make it painless and easy, and nothing to worry about. Instead, he told the truth. "Yes, it's going to hurt, but it will save your life." Martin nodded slowly. Then he lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. Morrison marked the entry point between the 5th and 6th ribs, the intercostal space where the needle could slip between bone and reach the pleural cavity. He injected Novocaine, 30 seconds for it to take effect. Martin's breathing didn't change. Still shallow, still careful. Morrison positioned the needle, placed his hand flat against Martin's ribs to stabilize, pressed forward. The needle penetrated skin, fascia, muscle, then the tough membrane of the pleura. There was a moment of resistance, then a pop so subtle Morrison felt it more than heard it. Fluid began to drain immediately. Dark red blood mixed with clear pleural fluid flowed into the collection bottle at the bedside. Morrison watched the volume carefully. Too much drainage too fast could cause the lung to re-expand violently and tear further. Too little left the pressure in place, 100 milliliters, 150, 200. Morrison stopped, removed the needle, bandaged the site, gave orders to the nurse on duty, a young woman from Tennessee who had volunteered for the Red Cross and ended up assigned to POW medical care. Her name was Sarah, not Eleanor. Morrison's wife Eleanor was back in Pennsylvania caring for her aging mother, had been for 3 months. The separation was hard but necessary. Family came first. Martin would stay flat on his back for the next 6 hours. No movement, no talking, no sitting up, oxygen through nasal tube, intravenous fluids for blood pressure, liquid diet only. Martin obeyed without question. Over the next 2 days, Morrison checked Martin's breathing every 4 hours. The lung was re-expanding, slowly, painfully, but consistently. The crackling sound in the stethoscope grew quieter. The boy's breathing rate dropped from 28 to 24 to 21. Still high, but better. Morrison ordered blood tests. The results came back 48 hours later. Severe anemia, red blood cell count 30% below normal, deficient in vitamin B and C, liver enzymes slightly elevated. Martin's body had been metabolizing its own muscle tissue for energy. He had been starving for months, maybe longer. Morrison wrote a detailed report, recommended extended medical observation, a controlled refeeding protocol, a formal investigation into conditions at the French detention camp. The report was filed. No investigation was launched. There were thousands of prisoners moving through the system. Martin was just one of them. The machinery of war had no time to pause for one 18-year-old boy. But Morrison didn't forget. He checked Martin every morning before making rounds, listened to his lungs, monitored his weight, watched the scars begin to fade. And slowly over 3 weeks, Martin began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might survive this war after all. On the third day, Morrison tried something different. He brought breakfast, not the usual liquid diet, real food, 3 strips of bacon, crispy, still warm from the kitchen, 2 scrambled eggs cooked in butter, a slice of white bread with strawberry jam, a cup of coffee with real cream and sugar. Martin stared at the tray like it was a hallucination. In the French camp, he had gotten watery soup once a day, sometimes twice if the guards were feeling generous. The soup was made from potato peels and whatever vegetables were too rotten to feed the guards. Sometimes there was bread. Usually it was green with mold. Martin had learned to scrape the mold off and eat it anyway because hunger was worse than sickness. But this tray, this breakfast, this was something from a dream. Is this for me? Morrison nodded. Martin looked at the bacon, then at Morrison, then back at the bacon. It's a trick. You want to poison me or make me weak. Morrison understood. In the French camp, food had been a weapon, given or withheld based on the mood of the guards. Martin had learned that nothing was free. Everything came with a price. Morrison picked up one of the bacon strips from Martin's tray, bit into it, chewed slowly, swallowed. See, not poisoned, just breakfast. Martin still didn't move. Morrison set the bacon down and sat in the chair beside the bed. He didn't speak, didn't push, just waited. 3 minutes passed, then 5. Finally, Martin reached out and picked up the bacon, held it close to his nose. Inhaled, the smell of salt and fat and smoke. The smell of something that had been cooked with care instead of obligation. He took a small bite, chewed carefully. His eyes went wide. Then he started crying. Not sobs, not dramatic grief, just tears rolling down his face while he chewed. Silent, steady, like his body was releasing something it had been holding for too long. Morrison didn't ask why. He knew. Martin had forgotten that food could taste like this, that meals could be something other than survival, that eating could be an act of pleasure instead of desperation. The boy finished the bacon, then the eggs, then the bread, then the coffee, every bite slow and deliberate like he was memorizing the taste. When the tray was empty, Martin looked at Morrison and spoke in broken English. 3 words. Practice from a phrase book. Thank you, sir. Morrison nodded. You're welcome. Over the next 2 weeks, Martin ate 6 small meals a day. The caloric intake increased gradually. 1,200 calories per day, then 1,500, then 2,000. His weight climbed 114 pounds. 117, 122. The scars stayed, but the fear began to fade. On day 15, something changed. The breakfast tray arrived. Bacon, eggs, toast, the usual. But Martin didn't eat. He pushed the tray away and stared at the wall. Morrison was called in. He found Martin sitting up in bed, arms wrapped around his knees, breathing fast and shallow again. Not from pain, from panic. "What's wrong?" Mueller translated. Martin spoke quietly, haltingly, like the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. In France, the strong prisoners were chosen for labor details. They picked men who looked healthy, who could work hard, and when those men couldn't work hard enough, they were beaten, over and over until they were too weak to be chosen again. Being weak was armor. Being strong was a target. If I eat too much, if I get too healthy, someone will hurt me again. Morrison listened. Then he pulled the chair close to Martin's bed and spoke slowly, clearly, giving Mueller time to translate every word. "The rules have changed. You're not in France anymore. Here, no one hits you for being strong. No one punishes you for being healthy. Here, survival means healing, not hiding. I know it's hard to believe, but I need you to try, Mom." Martin looked at him, really looked at him, searching Morrison's face for the lie, for the trap, for the catch. He didn't find one. 3 days later, Martin started eating again. By day 28, he weighed 131 pounds. His lung function was at 90%. His red blood cell count had climbed to 75% of normal. He could walk without assistance, stand without dizziness, breathe without pain. Morrison signed the discharge papers. Martin would be transferred to the general population. Barracks 14, a long wooden building that housed 20 prisoners. Some Wehrmacht soldiers, some Luftwaffe crew, one former naval officer, all of them waiting for the war to end so they could go home. Martin packed his belongings, which meant he put on a clean shirt and picked up the small Bible the Red Cross had given him. That was all he owned in the world. Before he left the hospital, Morrison stopped him at the door. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph. A young man in a Marine uniform, 19 years old, dark hair, bright smile, the kind of face that belonged to someone who believed the world was fundamentally good. "This is my son, David. He's in the Pacific right now. I haven't heard from him in 6 weeks." Morrison's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he held the photograph. "Every time I treat a prisoner, I think about David. I think about what would happen if he was captured. I think about whether someone would save him the way I'm trying to save you. So when I look at you, Martin, I don't see an enemy. I see someone's son, and I'm doing for you what I hope someone would do for him." Martin took the photograph, studied it carefully, then handed it back. "I will pray for him." Morrison nodded, slipped the photo back into his wallet. "Thank you." What Morrison didn't know, what he couldn't know because the telegram hadn't arrived yet, was that David Morrison had been killed 3 weeks earlier, shot by a sniper on a beach in Iwo Jima, dead before his body hit the sand. The telegram was sitting in an office in Washington, waiting to be processed, waiting to destroy a father's hope. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of the camp hospital, with November light streaming through the windows, Morrison still had hope. And Martin had been given a second chance at life. Neither of them knew how much they would need each other in the months to come. Martin walked across the camp toward Barracks 14. Other prisoners watched him through the fence. Some nodded, some looked away. One older man, a sergeant with hard eyes and an iron cross pinned to his jacket, stared at Martin with open contempt. Martin didn't meet his gaze. He had learned in France that survival meant invisibility. That lesson hadn't left him yet. He reached the barracks and stepped inside. 20 bunks, wood stove in the center, windows that let in cold Missouri air. Men sitting on beds, writing letters, playing cards, talking in low voices. One man stood up immediately. Young, maybe 20, blonde hair and farmer's hands. He smiled and extended his hand. "Friedrich Holst, but everyone calls me Fritz. Welcome, I heard you were in the hospital. Glad you made it." Martin shook his hand carefully. "Martin Weber." Fritz gestured to an empty bunk in the corner. "That one's yours. It's quiet, away from the stove, so you won't get too hot at night. And it's near the window. I figured you might like fresh air after being inside so long." Martin set his Bible on the thin mattress and sat down. The bunk creaked but held. "Thank you." Fritz sat on the bunk across from Martin's and leaned forward, elbows on knees. Listen, I'm going to tell you something important. See that group over there? He nodded towards 6 men sitting together near the stove. The older sergeant with the iron cross was in the center. They were speaking German too quietly to hear, but their body language was tense, coiled. That's Sergeant Krauss and his men. They still think we're going to win this war. They still believe in the Fuhrer, and they don't like prisoners who seem too comfortable here. So keep your head down. Don't make friends with the guards. Don't smile too much. Just do your work and stay invisible. Martin understood. He had been practicing invisibility for months. That night, Martin lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of Barracks 14. Snoring, coughing, someone playing a harmonica softly, a tune Martin didn't recognize. Outside, the wind moved through the Missouri grassland like water. Clean, cold, free. For the first time since his capture, Martin felt something close to peace. But peace, he would learn, was a fragile thing, and the war was not yet over. Morning in Barracks 14 began at 6 o'clock with the sound of a bell. Sharp, metallic. Not cruel, just punctual. Martin had learned in France to wake before the guards arrived, to be standing and ready before violence had a chance to find him. Here the bell was just a bell, but his body remembered. He was always awake 5 minutes early. The prisoners filed out into the November cold for roll call, 200 men standing in lines while American guards counted them with clipboards and board efficiency. No shouting, no beatings, just names being checked off a list. Martin waited for the moment when it would turn ugly, when someone would decide to make an example, when the facade of civility would crack. It never did. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, long tables, metal trays, food that steamed in the cold morning air, oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, coffee that was actually hot. Martin ate slowly, still cautious, still waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake, that this food wasn't for prisoners, that he had broken some rule he didn't understand. Fritz sat across from him and grinned. You look like you're waiting for an ambush. Martin didn't deny it. In France, if you ate too fast, they said you were greedy. If you ate too slow, they said you were ungrateful. There was no right way, only wrong ways that earned different punishments. Fritz nodded, took a bite of toast. That's over now. Here you just eat. Nobody cares how fast or slow. Nobody's keeping score. Martin wanted to believe him. The oatmeal was warm and sweet. The coffee was strong enough to taste like something real. But belief was a luxury that required trust, and trust was something Martin had buried deep in a French prison yard. After breakfast came work assignments. Martin's name was called for farm detail, light duty, doctor's orders. He would be working with the agricultural crew maintaining the camp's vegetable gardens and livestock pens. The guard who announced it was young, mid-20s maybe. He had freckles and a Texas drawl that turned every word into something lazy and musical. Weber, you're with me today. Name's Corporal Anderson, but everyone just calls me Buck. Buck Anderson was 6 feet tall and built like someone who had spent his whole life doing hard work in the sun. He wore his uniform like it was a costume. Like underneath the army green, he was still a cowboy waiting for the war to end so he could go back to being what he really was. They walked together across the camp toward the farm area. Fields of winter wheat stubble, chicken coops, a small barn that housed 2 horses and a dairy cow. Everything was organized, clean, nothing like the chaos Martin had expected. Buck talked while they walked. His voice was easy, conversational, like Martin was a neighbor instead of a prisoner. You ever work on a farm before? Martin shook his head. I grew up in Hamburg, city boy. My father was a teacher. Buck nodded like that made perfect sense. Well, farm work ain't complicated. Just gotta feed the chickens, collect eggs, mend fences when they break, keep the animals happy. And if you do it right, nobody bothers you. It's honest work. The kind that makes you tired in a good way instead of a bad way. You know what I mean, Martin did. In France, exhaustion had been a punishment, something inflicted. Here it sounded like something earned. They spent the morning repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by wind. Buck showed Martin how to hammer the nails at an angle so they held better, how to test the tension on the wire so it wouldn't sag, how to work with your hands in a way that felt productive instead of pointless. While they worked, Buck talked about Texas, about growing up on a ranch outside San Antonio, about learning to ride before he learned to read, about enlisting after Pearl Harbor because it seemed like the right thing to do even though he hated leaving the ranch and the horses in the wide open sky. Thought I'd see combat, thought I'd be doing something important. Instead, they stuck me here watching German boys who don't want to fight anymore. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful I'm not getting shot at, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing my part. Martin listened. He didn't know what to say. Buck's honesty felt dangerous, like something that could be used against him. But Buck didn't seem to care. He just kept talking. Easy. Open, like there were no secrets worth keeping. Around noon, Buck pulled a canteen from his belt and took a long drink. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass bottle. Dark brown, curved, beaded with condensation even in the cold November air. He held it out to Martin. "You ever had a Coca-Cola?" Martin stared at the bottle like it was some kind of puzzle. He had seen advertisements, pictures in magazines that the Red Cross brought to the camp. Happy families drinking from bottles just like this one. But he had never held one, never tasted it. "What is it?" Buck grinned. "Son, that's America in a bottle. Sweet, fizzy, cold as a creek in January. Go on, try it." Martin took the bottle carefully. It was heavier than he expected. The glass was slick with moisture. He tilted it back and took a small sip. The fizz hit his tongue first. Sharp, aggressive, like tiny needles of carbonation. Then came the sweetness. More sugar than he had ever tasted in one mouthful. It burned down his throat in the best way possible. Cold and hot at the same time. Strange and wonderful, and completely unlike anything he had ever experienced. He looked at Buck with wide eyes. "This is what Americans drink." Buck laughed, full and loud. The kind of laugh that didn't have room for cruelty. "Every day if we can get it. Some guys prefer coffee or beer. But me, I'll take a Coke over just about anything. Makes life taste better, you know." Martin took another sip, slower this time, savoring it. If this is what America tastes like, maybe we were fighting the wrong side. He said it without thinking. The words just came out, and for a moment Martin froze, waiting for Buck to get angry, waiting for the mask to drop, waiting for the punishment. Instead, Buck just slapped him on the shoulder. "Hell, son, maybe you were." They finished the fence in the afternoon. By the time they walked back toward the barracks, Martin's hands hurt in a way that felt good, productive. His body was tired but not broken. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this place was different. That night, Fritz brought something to Martin's bunk. A magazine. Life. The cover showed an American family at Thanksgiving dinner. Turkey, potatoes, children laughing. Everything warm and golden and perfect. The nurses pass these around sometimes. "I thought you might want to look." Martin took the magazine and flipped through the pages. Photographs of American life. Factories, cities, farmland, baseball games, movie theaters, women in fashionable dresses, men in suits reading newspapers on park benches. Everything looked clean, prosperous, free. This was the enemy he had been taught to hate. The mongrel nation with no culture. The land of materialism and moral decay. But looking at these photographs, all Martin saw were people living, really living, not surviving, not enduring, just existing in a world where meals were regular and children played without fear. Fritz leaned over and pointed to a photograph of a cowboy on horseback. Desert landscape, mountains in the background, wide open sky, and that's what Buck probably looked like before the war. You can tell he's not made for this. He's made for that. Martin studied the photograph. The cowboy's face was turned away from the camera, but his posture was confident, easy, like he and the horse and the land were all part of the same thing. Like freedom was something you could wear like a hat. "Do you think they would let me try?" "Try what, riding a horse?" Fritz raised an eyebrow. "You'd have to ask Buck. But I bet he'd say yes. Americans are strange that way. They'll teach you things just for the hell of it, like they forget you're supposed to be the enemy." Martin closed the magazine and set it carefully on the small shelf beside his bunk. That night he dreamed of open fields and animals that trusted you, and skies so big you could disappear into them without ever feeling lost. 3 days later, Buck asked Martin if he wanted to learn to ride. They walked to the small barn after the morning work was done. Inside, two horses stood in their stalls. One was old and gray, the other was younger. Brown, strong shoulders, and intelligent eyes. This here's Dusty. He's a good horse, patient. Won't throw you unless you do something real stupid. You ever been on a horse before? Martin shook his head. In Germany, only rich people had horses. I only saw them in parades. Buck nodded. Well, every man ought to know how to ride, especially if he's going to spend time in Texas. Come on, I'll teach you. Buck showed Martin how to approach Dusty from the side. How to let the horse smell your hand. How to speak quietly so the animal knew you weren't a threat. Then he demonstrated how to mount. Left foot in the stirrup, right leg swinging over. Settling into the saddle like you belong there. Your turn. Martin stepped forward. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from anticipation. Dusty turned his head and looked at Martin with one large dark eye. Patient, waiting. Martin put his foot in the stirrup, pulled himself up, swung his leg over, and suddenly he was sitting 6 feet off the ground on a living, breathing creature that could throw him at any moment. Buck handed him the reins. Hold these like you're holding a bird, firm enough it can't fly away, gentle enough you don't crush it. And just give him a little kick with your heels. Not hard, just enough to say hello. Martin did. Dusty started walking, slow, steady, around the paddock in a circle. And for the first time since his capture, Martin felt something he had forgotten existed. Joy. Pure. Uncomplicated. The kind of happiness that doesn't need a reason. He was sitting on a horse in Missouri in the middle of a war, and nothing about it made sense. But it felt right anyway. Like this was what life was supposed to be. Movement, purpose, freedom even inside the boundaries of a fence. Buck walked beside them, calling out instructions. Sit up straight. Don't pull too hard on the reins. Let the horse feel your weight. Trust him, and he'll trust you. After 20 minutes, Buck helped Martin dismount. Martin's legs were shaking. His back hurt. His hands were stiff from gripping the reins too tightly, and he was grinning like an idiot. How'd it feel? Martin looked at Buck, then at Dusty, then out at the Missouri grassland rolling away toward the horizon. Like I'm free, even though I'm a prisoner. Buck smiled, adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. Son, you're not really a prisoner here. You're just on vacation from a war you didn't start. Make the most of it. Tant. That night, Martin told Fritz about riding Dusty, about the feeling of being above the ground, about how Buck had treated him like a student instead of an enemy, about how strange and wonderful it was to learn something just because someone wanted to teach it. Fritz listened. Then he leaned back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. I worked in a factory before the war. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, making parts for machines I never saw completed, never rode a horse, never drank Coca-Cola, never tasted bacon cooked the way they cook it here. Sometimes I think we lost the war, but we won something else. What's that? We discovered what life could be like. Real life, not Hitler's version, not the propaganda about glory and sacrifice, just ordinary life, where people eat good food and teach each other things and don't beat you for asking questions. Martin thought about that, about the 3 strips of bacon, about the Coca-Cola, about Dusty's patient eyes and Buck's easy laugh, about Captain Morrison saving his life, because that's what doctors did even for enemies. Fritz was right. They had lost the war, but they had found something else, something that didn't have a name yet, something that felt like hope. The next morning at breakfast, Sergeant Krause was waiting. He didn't say anything, just watched Martin from across the mess hall. His face was hard, judgmental. The kind of expression that said he had already decided you were guilty and was just waiting for the evidence to catch up. Martin felt Fritz tense beside him. Ignore him. He's been watching everyone, looking for traitors, people who are getting too comfortable here. What does he want? To remind us we're still German. That enjoying this place is a betrayal, that we should be suffering to honor the fatherland. Martin looked down at his oatmeal. It was warm, sweet, exactly the same as yesterday, but suddenly it tasted like guilt. Fritz leaned closer and lowered his voice. Don't let him get in your head. Krause is fighting a war that's already over. He just doesn't know it yet. But Martin couldn't shake the feeling. Krause's eyes followed him all through breakfast, all through roll call. And later, when Martin was working in the garden pulling up dead tomato vines, he looked up and saw Krause standing at the fence, watching, always watching. That afternoon, Buck brought Martin a radio, small, battery-powered, army issue. He set it on the fence post and turned the dial until music came through the static. Jazz, horns and drums and a piano that danced through the melody like water over stones. You like music, Martin had never really thought about it. In Germany, music had been marching songs, propaganda set to melody, designed to make you feel proud and obedient and small all at the same time. But this music was different. It was happy, genuinely happy. No agenda, no message, just people playing instruments because it felt good. I've never heard music like this. Buck leaned against the fence and closed his eyes. Let the music wash over him. That's jazz, born in New Orleans, made by black folks who took all the pain and struggle and form of being alive in America and turned it into something beautiful. Some people hate it, say it's immoral or corrupted or whatever. But me, I think it's the most honest music ever made. It doesn't lie, it just is. They worked in silence for a while. The music played, the afternoon sun moved across the sky, and Martin felt something shift inside him. Something he couldn't name yet, but it felt like understanding, like seeing the world from a different angle and realizing that everything you had been taught was wrong. That evening, Martin wrote a letter home, his first letter since capture. Fritz helped him with the German words he had forgotten, helped him find a way to say "I'm alive" without explaining everything that had happened to keep him that way. Dear Mother, I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't know if you're still in Hamburg, but I have to try. I was captured in Normandy. I am in America now, in Missouri. They treat us well here. There is food, there are beds. There are doctors who save lives instead of taking them. I am safe. I will come home when the war ends. Please tell Anna I love her. Please know that I think of you every day. Your son, Martin. He didn't mention the punctured lung, didn't mention France, didn't mention the beatings or the starvation or the moment when he thought he would die on a transport ship in the middle of the Atlantic. He just told her he was safe because that was all that mattered. That was the only truth that would let her sleep at night. Fritz took the letter to the Red Cross station the next morning. It would take months to arrive. Maybe it wouldn't arrive at all. But Martin had said the words, had put them on paper, had sent them out into the world like a prayer. On Sunday, there was no work. The prisoners were allowed to organize activities. Some played soccer, some held prayer services. Some just sat in the sun and wrote letters or read books from the camp library. Buck found Martin sitting alone near the barn. Dusty was in the paddock grazing peacefully. The November air was cold, but the sun was warm. Martin was reading the Life magazine Fritz had given him, studying the photographs like they were maps to a country he didn't understand yet. Buck sat down beside him. You settling in okay? Martin nodded. It's different here. Good different, but different. Buck picked up a piece of grass and put it between his teeth. Cowboy habit. Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Okay. Did you believe in it? The Nazi stuff, the hate, the superiority, all that. Martin was quiet for a long time. The question deserved a real answer, not the easy one. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11, I believed what everyone told me, that Germany was special, that we had been wronged, that we deserved to be great again. It made sense when you were a child. It made you feel like you belonged to something important. But then I got older, and I started seeing what that greatness actually meant. The neighbors who disappeared, the fear in my father's voice when he talked about politics, the way people stopped asking questions. And by the time they sent me to fight, I didn't believe anymore. But I went anyway. Because what choice did I have? Buck nodded slowly. I get that. Most of the prisoners here are like you, just boys who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. That's why I don't mind teaching you to ride or sharing a Coke. Because I figure if we can treat each other like human beings, now maybe we can stop making the same mistakes later. They sat in silence for a while. Dusty wandered over to the fence and pushed his nose against Martin's hand. Martin scratched behind the horse's ears, the simple pleasure of touching something alive, and warm and trusting. Buck stood up and stretched. You know what I think, Martin? I think you're going to be okay. I think whatever happened to you before you got here tried to break you, but it didn't. You're still here, still learning, still trying to make sense of it all. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. Martin looked up at him. Thank you for everything, for teaching me, for treating me like I matter. Buck tipped his hat. That's the whole point, son. Everyone matters. He walked away. Martin watched him go, watched the easy confidence in his stride, the way he belonged to this land like it had been made for him. And Martin thought about Hamburg, about narrow streets and gray skikis and the constant feeling of being watched, about rules that changed without warning, about fear that lived in your stomach like a stone. And he thought about Texas, about wide open spaces and cowboys who shared Coca-Cola and horses who let you ride them and doctors who saved your life just because that's what doctors did. 4 months ago, Martin had believed America was the enemy, the destroyer of culture, the land of moral decay. But now sitting in the Missouri sun with Dusty's warm breath on his hand and jazz music still playing somewhere in his memory, Martin understood something new. He had been lied to for 18 years about everything. That night, Sergeant Krause made his move. The mess hall was crowded at dinner, 200 men eating in relative silence, the clatter of forks on metal trays, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of German conversations that never got too loud, because even here, even in safety, old habits of caution remained. Martin was halfway through his meal when Krause appeared. The sergeant didn't approach directly. He never did. Instead, he walked past Martin's table slowly, deliberately, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. When he reached the end of the table, he stopped and turned, looked directly at Martin, his eyes cold, calculating. The eyes of someone who had already decided you were guilty and was simply waiting for the right moment to pronounce sentence. I saw you yesterday, riding that horse, laughing with the American Guard. Martin set down his fork. Fritz tensed beside him. Krause leaned forward, placed both hands on the table. You're becoming one of them. You're forgetting who you are. Forgetting what we're fighting for. Forgetting that these people are the enemy. Martin met his gaze, held it. Something had shifted inside him over the past weeks. The fear that had kept him small in France was still there, but it was competing now with something else, something harder to name. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was clarity. Maybe it was just exhaustion with being afraid. I haven't forgotten anything. I'm just learning. Learning how to be a traitor. Learning that the enemy might not be who we were told it was. The mess hall went quiet. Not completely, but quiet enough that the men at nearby tables stopped eating, stopped talking, started paying attention. Krause's face went red. He reached across the table and knocked Martin's tray onto the floor. Food scattered. The metal tray rang against concrete. 3 strips of bacon lay in the dirt. Wasted, ruined. That bacon is worth more than your ideology. Martin said it quietly, but everyone heard. Krause grabbed Martin by the collar and yanked him up from the bench. Fritz stood up immediately. So did 2 other prisoners, but Krause's men were faster. They moved in from the sides. 6 of them, forming a circle. You little traitor. You think because the Americans are soft with you, because they feed you and give you toys to play with, that makes them right. You think comfort is the same as truth. Martin looked at the bacon on the floor, then back at Krause. I think truth is whatever keeps you alive, and your truth almost killed me. Krause shoved Martin backwards, hard. Martin stumbled, his back hit the edge of the next table. Pain shot through his ribs. The old injury, the punctured lung that Morrison had saved. It wasn't fully healed yet, would never be fully healed, and Krause had just reminded him of that. Martin doubled over, coughed, tasted copper, not a lot, just enough to know something had torn slightly, just enough to know he was bleeding inside again. Fritz lunged forward, but Krause's men held him back. The mess hall erupted, prisoners shouting, some supporting Krause, some defending Martin, guards rushing in from all sides, whistles blowing, the organized calm of the camp collapsing into chaos. Buck was the first guard to reach them. He pushed through the crowd, saw Martin on the ground, saw Krause standing over him, saw the blood on Martin's lips. What the hell happened here? Kraus straightened, composed himself. His English was excellent. A disagreement. Nothing more. The boy lost his balance. Buck looked at Martin, then at Fritz, then at the bacon scattered on the floor. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what had happened. Kraus, you're coming with me, you and your men. Now. Kraus didn't argue. He just smiled, cold, satisfied, like he had proven his point. Like getting punished was worth it if it meant reminding everyone who they really were. The guards separated them. Kraus and his men were marched toward the administrative building. Martin was helped to his feet by Fritz and another prisoner. He could stand, could breathe, but every breath hurt now. Sharp, stabbing. The familiar sensation of something wrong inside his chest. Buck put a hand on Martin's shoulder. We need to get you back to the hospital. Let Morrison check you out. Martin nodded, couldn't speak. The coughing had started again, small, controlled, but persistent. They walked across the camp in the cold March evening. The sun was setting, streaks of orange and purple across the Missouri sky. Beautiful, indifferent to human violence. Martin focused on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other, on not collapsing until they reached the hospital door. Morrison was in his office when they arrived. He looked up, saw Martin's face, saw the blood. His expression went from tired to alert in half a second. What happened? Fight in the mess hall. Another prisoner pushed him. I think he might have re-injured the lung. Morrison moved quickly, guided Martin to an examination bed, pulled out his stethoscope, listened to both lungs. Left side normal, right side. Pause. Frown, crackling, faint. But there, damn it. Morrison's voice was quiet, controlled. But Martin heard the frustration underneath, the anger at having to fix something that had already been fixed once. It's not as bad as before, but there's some fluid accumulating again. You're going to need to stay here overnight, maybe longer, and no more physical altercations. Your lung can't take it. Martin nodded. Morrison looked at Buck. What started it, Sergeant Kraus? One of the hardliners. Doesn't like prisoners getting too friendly with Americans. Thinks it's a betrayal. Morrison's jaw tightened. I'll file a report. Kraus will be transferred to another barracks, isolated from the general population. If he can't behave, he'll spend the rest of the war in solitary. Buck nodded, looked at Martin. I'm sorry, kid. Should have seen that coming. Martin found his voice. It was rough, thin, but functional. Not your fault. Kraus has been looking for a reason. I gave him one. What reason? I told him his ideology was worthless. Buck laughed, short, sharp, almost proud. Well, can't say you're wrong. He left. Morrison prepared an IV drip. Antibiotics, pain medication. Fluids to keep Martin hydrated while his body worked on healing itself again. While they worked, neither of them spoke. But the silence was comfortable. The silence of two people who had been through this before and knew the routine. After the IV was in place, Morrison sat down in the chair beside Martin's bed. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago. Tired, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His hands were steady, but his shoulders were slumped, like he was carrying something heavy that he couldn't put down. Martin, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you stand up to Kraus? You could have just kept your head down, stayed quiet, avoided all of this. Martin thought about the question, about the bacon on the floor, about Dusty's patient eyes, about Buck sharing his Coca-Cola like it was the most natural thing in the world, about Morrison saving his life because that's what doctors did, because staying quiet in France almost killed me, because I spent 2 months invisible and it didn't protect me, because maybe the only way to survive is to stop pretending you don't exist. Morrison nodded slowly, like Martin had just said something important. You're braver than you think. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. Morrison stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the darkening camp. Lights were coming on in the barracks. Guard towers illuminated against the night sky. Everything organized, everything under control, everything except the chaos inside human hearts. I got a telegram 3 weeks ago. Morrison's voice was different now, hollow, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. My son David, the one I showed you the picture of. He was killed at Iwo Jima, shot by a sniper, died instantly. They said he didn't suffer, But that's what they always say, isn't it? Martin went still. The IV drip counted seconds. Drip, drip, drip. Morrison didn't turn around, just kept staring out the window. I saved you. I performed that procedure. I pulled 200 milliliters of blood and fluid out of your chest cavity, and I kept you alive. And the whole time I was thinking about David, thinking that if he was ever captured, if he was ever hurt, maybe someone would save him the same way. Maybe my kindness here would create kindness somewhere else, like the universe kept score, like good deeds were currency you could trade for the life of someone you loved. Morrison's voice cracked slightly. But it doesn't work that way. I saved you. And David died anyway. And I keep asking myself if it was worth it. If spending all that time on a German boy meant I wasn't doing something else that might have mattered more. If I made the wrong choice. Martin sat up slowly, ignoring the pain in his chest, ignoring the IV line pulling at his arm. He looked at Morrison's back, at the shoulders that carried the weight of a father's grief. Captain Morrison, sir, look at me, please. Morrison turned. His eyes were red, not crying, but close. You saved me so your son wouldn't have died for nothing. You showed me that even in war, humanity survives. That Americans really do value life, even enemy life. That the things we were told about you, about this country, were lies. David died fighting for that truth. And you live that truth every day. If you hadn't saved me, I would have died believing America was exactly what the Nazis said it was. But because of you, I know better. And I'll spend the rest of my life telling people what I learned here. Your son didn't die for nothing, and neither did your kindness. Morrison stood frozen. Then slowly he walked back to the chair and sat down, put his face in his hands, and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been holding something in for too long. Martin didn't speak, didn't try to comfort, just stayed present, just existed in the same space, bearing witness to grief that couldn't be fixed but could be shared. After a while, Morrison wiped his eyes, took a breath, composed himself the way doctors do, the way men who have responsibilities do, the way people who can't afford to break down completely do. Thank you, Martin. I needed to hear that. It's true. I know. That's why it helped. Martin spent 3 days in the hospital. The fluid in his lung was minor, just enough to cause pain, not enough to be dangerous. Morrison kept him for observation anyway, partly because it was medically prudent, partly because Martin needed rest, partly because Morrison needed someone to talk to who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. On the 3rd day, Fritz visited, brought news from Barracks 14. Kraus had been transferred to a different section of the camp. Isolated housing, no contact with general population. His men had been dispersed. The tension in the barracks had eased. People were talking again, playing cards. Some of them had even started asking about Martin, asking when he would return, wanting to know if he was okay. They're worried about you, even the ones who don't speak English, even the ones who were afraid to stand up to Kraus. They saw what you did. They saw you refuse to stay small. And it mattered. Martin didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process the idea that his moment of anger in the mess hall had meant something to people he barely knew. Fritz leaned back in his chair. Something else happened. Big news, really big. What Germany surrendered. Unconditional surrender. Signed it yesterday. The war in Europe is over. The words landed like stones in water. Ripples spreading outward, changing everything. Martin tried to understand what it meant. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Third Reich had fallen. Everything he had been told was permanent had collapsed. What happens now? Fritz shrugged. They're saying we'll be repatriated, eventually. Could be months. Could be a year. Depends on how long it takes to process everyone. But we get to go home, whenever that is. Home. Martin thought about Hamburg, about narrow streets and his mother's face, about Anna, about the house where he grew up, about Germany, about what would be left when this was all over. Are you happy that the war is over? Fritz thought about it. I'm relieved. That's different from happy. I'm relieved the killing has stopped. Relieved I don't have to go back to fighting. Relieved I might actually survive this. But happy I don't know. We lost everything. Our country, our future, our identity. What do we go back to? Martin understood. Victory would have been terrible in its own way, but defeat was a different kind of terrible, the kind that left you standing in rubble wondering what came next. That evening, the entire camp was assembled in the yard, 2,000 German prisoners standing in formation while the camp commander announced the news officially. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Repatriation would begin soon. Everyone would eventually go home. The reactions were mixed. Some men wept, some cheered, some stood in silence processing the fact that everything they had fought for had ended. Martin watched faces, saw grief, saw relief, saw confusion, saw the complicated truth that victory and defeat were never as simple as the words suggested. Fritz found Martin in the crowd, put a hand on his shoulder. "We did it. We survived." Martin nodded, but survival felt strange, like waking up from a dream you couldn't quite remember, like realizing you had been someone else for a long time, and now you had to figure out who you were supposed to be next. That night, Martin couldn't sleep. He lay in his hospital bed listening to the sounds of the camp at night. Distant voices, footsteps, the wind moving through the grassland like whispered prayers. He thought about Morrison, about David dying on a beach in the Pacific, about the telegram that had arrived too late to change anything, about grief that couldn't be fixed but had to be carried anyway. He thought about Buck, about the easy way he shared Coca-Cola and taught riding lessons and treated enemies like neighbors, about the America that existed in cowboy hats and jazz music and the simple generosity of someone who had enough and didn't mind sharing. He thought about Krauss, about ideology that demanded loyalty even when it destroyed you, about the men who would go home still believing, still defending, still unable to admit that maybe, just maybe, everything they had been taught was wrong. And he thought about himself, about the boy who had left Hamburg believing in German superiority, about the soldier who had fought for 2 weeks before being captured, about the prisoner who had been beaten and starved and left to die, about the patient who had been saved by an enemy doctor, about the student who had learned to ride horses and drink Coca-Cola and see the world differently. He was all of those people, and none of them, and someone new who didn't have a name yet. 2 weeks later, Martin was released from the hospital, fully healed, again. Morrison signed the discharge papers, shook Martin's hand, held it for a moment longer than necessary. Eleanor had just returned from Pennsylvania. Morrison's mother-in-law had passed peacefully. Now Morrison and his wife could grieve together, for her mother, for their son, for the future they had imagined. Take care of yourself, Martin. And remember what I told you about David, about why this mattered. I will. I promise. Martin walked back to Barracks 14. Fritz greeted him with a grin and another magazine. More pictures of America. More images of a life that seemed impossible from inside a prison camp, but felt real now. Felt like something you could touch if you just knew how. The next 3 months passed in a strange rhythm. Work detail, meals, letters home that might not arrive. Waiting, always waiting, for news, for orders, for the paperwork that would eventually send them back across the Atlantic to whatever remained of Germany. In June, Buck brought Martin back to the barn, let him ride Dusty one more time. They circled the paddock slowly. No words, just the sound of hooves on dirt and wind through grass, and two people who had somehow become friends despite every reason not to. When Martin dismounted, Buck handed him something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a cowboy hat, old, worn, the leather sweatband stained dark from years of use. Can't let you go home without a piece of Texas. Martin held the hat like it was fragile, precious, a symbol of something he couldn't quite name, but knew he would carry forever. Thank you. For everything, for treating me like I mattered. Buck nodded. That's the whole point, son. Everyone matters. Don't forget that when you go back. Don't let them convince you otherwise. In July, the orders came. Martin was scheduled for repatriation. He would leave in 2 weeks. Train to New York, ship to Germany, return to whatever was left. The night before he left, Morrison called him to his office. On the desk was a small wooden box. Morrison opened it. Inside was a watch, silver, simple, the kind that soldiers wore, the kind that kept time through battles and quiet moments and everything in between. This was David's. I want you to have it. Sir, I can't accept this. You can, and you will, because you reminded me why we fought this war. Not to kill, not to conquer, but to protect the possibility of moments like this, where enemies become friends, where cruelty gives way to kindness, where a German boy and an American doctor can sit in a room together and recognize each other as human beings. David would want you to have this, and I need you to carry it, to remember. Martin took the watch, fastened it around his wrist. It was too big, but he would grow into it. I'll take care of it, I promise. And I'll tell people about you, about America, about what I learned here. I'll make sure your son's sacrifice meant something. Morrison stood, extended his hand. Martin shook it, and then because words weren't enough, they embraced. Two men who had saved each other in different ways. Two men who would carry each other forward into whatever came next. The train left the next morning. Martin stood on the platform with 50 other prisoners waiting to board. Fritz was with him. Buck was there too, and Morrison standing back, watching. When the train pulled away, Martin looked out the window, watched Missouri disappear, watched the grassland and the sky and the wide open spaces that had somehow given him back his life. He touched the watch on his wrist, felt the hat in his bag, tasted the memory of bacon and Coca-Cola and freedom that came from being treated like a human being instead of a number. The war was over, but Martin's story was just beginning. The ship arrived in Bremerhaven 3 weeks later, August 1946, more than a year since Germany's surrender. Martin stood on deck as the German coastline came into view, gray, broken, nothing like the country he remembered. Fritz stood beside him. Neither spoke. What was there to say? They were going home, but home no longer existed. The port was chaos, thousands of repatriated prisoners being processed through makeshift stations, American and British military police checking papers, Red Cross workers handing out information packets about displaced persons camps and reconstruction efforts. Everything efficient, everything organized, everything except the faces of the men who had finally made it back. Martin received his discharge papers, a temporary identity card, 50 Reichsmarks that were nearly worthless due to inflation, and a train ticket to Hamburg, or what remained of Hamburg. Fritz was being sent to Munich. They embraced at the station. Held on longer than was comfortable, because they both knew this might be goodbye forever. Take care of yourself, and remember what Buck said. That everyone matters. Fritz smiled, nodded, then he was gone. Disappeared into the crowd of men trying to find their way home. Martin boarded the train alone. The journey took 3 days, not because Hamburg was far, but because the railway infrastructure had been bombed so thoroughly that trains had to take circuitous routes through undamaged sections. Martin watched Germany pass by the window. Destroyed cities, cratered fields, refugees walking along roads with everything they owned on their backs. This was the fatherland he had been taught to love, the 1,000-year Reich that was supposed to bring glory to the German people. It had lasted 12 years and left nothing but rubble. The train pulled into Hamburg Hauptbahnhof on a gray afternoon. The station was partially destroyed. Half the roof was gone. Pigeons nested in the exposed rafters. Martin stepped onto the platform and looked around. He didn't recognize anything. The Hamburg of his childhood had been a city of tall buildings and busy streets, a port city full of commerce and culture. What he saw now was a wasteland. 70% of the city had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Operation Gomorrah in 1943 had killed 40,000 people in a single week, created a firestorm that melted asphalt and turned entire neighborhoods into ash. Martin walked through streets that used to have names. Now they were just paths between rubble. He passed women digging through debris, children playing in bomb craters, old men sitting on broken furniture in front of buildings that no longer had walls. He reached his old neighborhood, Rothenbaum Chaussee, a street that had once been lined with elegant houses. His family had lived at number 47, a 3-story building with a garden in back where his mother grew roses. Number 47 no longer existed. The entire block had been leveled. Nothing remained except foundations and scattered bricks. Martin stood in the middle of what used to be his street and tried to remember what it had looked like. Tried to superimpose memory onto ruins. He couldn't. For the first time since leaving Missouri, Martin cried, not silent tears like when he ate bacon. This was different, deeper, the kind of crying that comes from losing something you can never get back. Childhood, home, the belief that the world makes sense A woman's voice interrupted him. German, tired. Are you looking for someone? Martin turned. An older woman stood nearby, thin, gray hair, eyes that had seen too much. The Weber family. They lived here before the war. She nodded slowly. Elizabeth Weber and her daughter. They survived the bombings, evacuated to the countryside in '43, came back after the war ended. They're in the displaced persons camp now. Alsterdorf, about 3 kilometers north. Martin thanked her, started walking. The displaced persons camp was a converted warehouse complex. Hundreds of families living in rooms separated by hanging blankets. Communal kitchens, shared bathrooms. The smell of too many people living in too little space. But it was shelter. It was safety. It was better than the streets. Martin asked the camp administrator about Elizabeth Weber. The man checked a ledger, nodded, pointed to Section C, Room 17. Martin walked through the camp, past families eating dinner from tin plates, past children doing homework by candlelight, past a man playing accordion while others sang old folk songs, everyone trying to create normalcy in a place that was anything but normal. He reached Room 17. A blanket hung across the doorway. Martin stood outside for a full minute. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. He had survived a punctured lung, survived France, survived the Atlantic crossing, survived a year in Missouri. But standing outside this blanket terrified him more than anything else. Because what if they didn't recognize him? What if he had changed too much? What if the boy who left Hamburg in 1943 was gone forever? He knocked on the wall beside the doorway. A woman's voice. Suspicious. Cautious. Yes, mutter. It's me. It's Martin. Silence. Then footsteps. The blanket pulled aside. His mother stood there. 46 years old, but looking 60. Hair that had been brown was now mostly gray. Skin lined with worry and hunger, and years of fear. She stared at Martin like she was seeing a ghost. 5 seconds of silence. Then she threw her arms around him and held on like he might disappear. Martin, my God, Martin, you're alive. You're alive, a younger voice from inside the room. Mama, who is it? Anna appeared, 16 years old now. The last time Martin had seen her, she was 13, still a child. Now she was almost a woman, taller, thinner, eyes that had lost their innocence. She looked at Martin, blinked, then her face crumpled, and she started crying. I thought you were dead. We thought you were dead. The three of them stood in the doorway holding each other, crying, not speaking, just existing in the miracle of being together again. Eventually they moved inside. The room was small, 2 beds, a table, a few possessions. Everything they owned in the world could fit in 2 suitcases. Elizabeth made tea from herbs she had been saving. They sat around the table. And Martin told them a version of his story. He told them he had been captured at Normandy, sent to a prisoner of war camp in America, in Missouri, that he had been treated well, fed properly, given medical care, that he had worked on a farm, learned English, made friends with some of the guards. What he didn't tell them was about France, about the beatings, about the punctured lung, about thinking he would die on a transport ship, about Morrison and David and the weight of grief that saved his life, about the moment he realized everything he had been taught about America was a lie. He told them enough to ease their worry, but not enough to make them understand what he had really been through. Anna asked questions. What was America like? What did people eat? Did Martin see cowboys? Were there really cars everywhere? Her questions were innocent, curious. She wanted to know about a country she had only read about in books. Martin answered carefully. Yes, there were cowboys, and cars, and more food than anyone knew what to do with, and people who were kind even to enemies, and a sense of freedom that it was hard to explain but impossible to forget. Elizabeth listened quietly. Then she asked the question Martin had been dreading. Did you have enough to eat? Were you warm? Did they hurt you? Martin looked at his mother, saw the worry lines around her eyes, saw the way her hands trembled slightly when she held her teacup, saw a woman who had lost her husband to etiology, who had spent 3 years not knowing if her son was alive, who had survived Hamburg's destruction and come back to nothing. He couldn't tell her the truth, not all of it, because she had already carried enough. I had enough, Mother. I was warm. I was safe. And now I'm home. Elizabeth reached across the table and took Martin's hand. Thank God. Thank God you're home. That night, Martin lay on a thin mattress on the floor of room 17. Anna slept in one bed, Elizabeth in the other. Elizabeth had gone. Outside, the sounds of the camp at night, coughing, crying, whispered conversations, people trying to sleep in a place that would never feel like home. Martin touched the watch on his wrist, David's watch, felt the cowboy hat folded carefully in his bag, remembered Missouri, remembered Buck's laugh and Morrison's quiet strength and the taste of Coca-Cola and the feeling of sitting on Dusty's back and seeing the world from a different angle. He had survived the war, but he wasn't sure he had survived intact. Over the next months, Martin found work. The occupation authorities needed laborers to clear rubble, to rebuild roads, to reconstruct infrastructure. The work was hard, physical. His lung hurt sometimes when he lifted heavy beams or worked in cold weather. But it was honest work, the kind Buck had talked about, the kind that made you tired in a good way. By 1948, his family had been assigned a small apartment, 3 rooms in a partially rebuilt building. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Martin got a better job working construction for a British company. The pay was decent, enough to buy food, enough to start saving. In 1950, Martin met Ingrid. She was 26, worked as a secretary for the city administration. They married that fall in a small ceremony attended by family and a few friends. The reception was held in the apartment Elizabeth had helped them find. Wine and bread and whatever food people could contribute. Nothing fancy, but it was real. It was life continuing. In 1952, their first child was born, a son. Martin named him David. Ingrid asked why that name. Martin held his newborn son and looked out the window at Hamburg, at a city slowly rising from ruins, at people who had learned to keep living despite everything. Someone I knew once told me his son's name was David. He died in the war. I want to honor that. I want to remember that sometimes enemies aren't enemies. Sometimes they're just people trying to do the right thing. Ingrid didn't understand, not really, but she accepted it. And David Morrison Weber grew up healthy and strong in a Germany that was determined never to make the same mistakes again. Martin never told his family about the punctured lung, never told them about France, never told them about the nights he woke up gasping, about how he couldn't ride the U-Bahn because enclosed spaces triggered panic, about how sudden loud noises made him flinch, about the nightmares that never quite went away. In 1955, a doctor examining Martin for a construction job noticed the scar tissue on his lungs, asked what happened. Martin said it was a war injury. The doctor classified him as partially disabled. Martin received a small pension from the government, 80 Deutsche Marks per month. It wasn't much, but it helped. The years passed, David grew up, 2 more children followed. Thomas in 1954, Maria in 1957. Martin worked hard, provided for his family, became the kind of father who was present but quiet, who loved fiercely but struggled to show it, who carried weight that no one else could see. He never watched war movies, never joined veterans associations, never talked about his service. When the children asked, Ingrid would say their father fought bravely and came home. That was all they needed to know. But Martin wrote letters, twice a year, every May and every December. He wrote to Captain James Morrison at an address in California. Long letters in careful English, telling Morrison about his life, about Hamburg rebuilding, about his children, about the Germany that was emerging from the ashes. And Morrison wrote back, long letters about Missouri, about the camp closing in 1946, about retirement, about Eleanor and how they had learned to live with David's absence, about the watch that Martin wore and whether it still kept good time. The letters continued for 30 years. In December of 1975, Morrison wrote that his health was failing, that doctors had given him months, maybe a year, that he wanted to see Martin one more time before the end. Martin was 49 years old. He had never been on an airplane, had never left Germany since returning in 1946, but he bought a ticket to Los Angeles, used money he had been saving for years, told Ingrid he needed to do this, needed to say goodbye properly. The flight took 14 hours. Martin spent most of it staring out the window, watching the Atlantic pass below, the same ocean he had crossed twice before, once half dead, once finally alive. Los Angeles shocked him. So much sun, so many cars, so much space. It was overwhelming in a way Missouri never had been, but it was also familiar. This was the America he remembered. Big, confident, moving forward. Morrison was living in a retirement home in Pasadena. Martin took a taxi from the airport, arrived in the late afternoon. The facility was nice, gardens, palm trees. Nothing like the camp hospital in Missouri, but somehow it felt similar. The same sense of people waiting, for healing or for the end. A nurse led Martin to Morrison's room. The door was open. Morrison sat in a wheelchair by the window. Thinner than Martin remembered. Frailer. But the eyes were the same. Sharp. Kind. Seeing more than most people did. Morrison, the old doctor, turned, looked at Martin, and smiled. Martin, my God, you came. You actually came. Martin crossed the room, knelt beside the wheelchair. Morrison reached out with a shaking hand and touched Martin's face. You look good, son. You look alive. Because of you, sir. Because 30 years ago you decided a German boy's life was worth saving. Morrison smiled. I didn't just save your life, Martin. You saved mine. After David died, I wanted to give up. But seeing you recover, seeing you become someone who mattered, it reminded me why we fought the war. Not to kill, but to protect the possibility of moments like this. They talk for hours about their families, about the years between letters, about the weight of carrying memories no one else understood, about what it meant to survive when so many hadn't. As the sun set, Morrison asked Martin to make a promise. Tell your children, tell your grandchildren, tell them about America, the real America, not the propaganda, not the politics, the America that fed you bacon when you were starving, that gave you Coca-Cola when you'd only known water, that taught you to ride horses and play music and see that enemies were just people on the other side of history's mistakes. I promise, sir, they already know. My son David, I tell him every day. Morrison's eyes filled with tears. You named your son David? Martin nodded. After your son. So his name would continue. So someone would remember that he died for something that mattered. Morrison put his face in his hands and cried. Martin stayed with him, bearing witness, the way Morrison had borne witness to Martin's suffering 30 years before. 3 weeks later, Morrison died peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was small. Eleanor had passed 2 years earlier. David had no siblings, just a few friends from the medical community, and Martin, who flew back from Hamburg to say goodbye. At the service, Martin spoke, told the gathered mourners about a doctor who had saved an enemy's life because that's what doctors did, about a man who lost his son but refused to lose his humanity, about kindness that transcended war and politics, and everything that tried to make people forget they were human. He didn't cry, couldn't cry. The grief was too big for tears. So he just stood at the front of the chapel and told the truth about James Morrison, about the debt that could never be repaid, about the legacy that would outlive them both. Martin returned to Hamburg, back to his life, his work, his family. But something had shifted. Morrison's death had closed a chapter, had severed the last connection to that time in Missouri when everything changed. Martin worked until 1986, retired at 60, spent his days with Ingrid, with his 7 grandchildren, building things, fixing things, teaching Thomas's son how to use a hammer properly, how to measure twice and cut once, how to take pride in work done well. He never rode another horse, never drank another Coca-Cola, never wore the cowboy hat Buck had given him except when he was alone in the apartment and Ingrid was out shopping. Then he would put it on and stand by the window and remember Texas. In November of 1992, Martin suffered a heart attack. Massive, sudden. He was 66 years old. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. That's what they always say. The funeral was held at a church in Hamburg. 200 people attended. Family, friends, co-workers, people whose names Martin had never learned, but whose lives he had touched through small acts of kindness that echoed what he had learned in Missouri. David Morrison Weber gave the eulogy. My father never talked much about the war. He would tell us small things, that he was captured, that he was sent to America, that he was treated well. But there was always more to the story, something he kept to himself, something too big to share. I didn't understand until I found his letters. After he died, my mother gave me a box. Inside were hundreds of letters. Letters to a man named Captain James Morrison. Letters that told the real story. About a boy who almost died. About a doctor who saved him. About discovering that everything you believed was wrong. About learning that kindness matters more than ideology. About enemies becoming brothers. My father named me after David Morrison, a Marine he never met, whose father saved my father's life. And through me, through my children, that legacy continues. The legacy of compassion, of seeing humanity even in those we're taught to hate, of refusing to let war make us forget what matters. My father was German by birth. He fought for Germany. He was captured by America. But in his heart, in the deepest part of who he was forever grateful for what America taught him. That everyone matters, that dignity isn't earned, that freedom is a gift we give each other. David paused, looked out at the congregation, at Martin's friends and family, and the people who had known him as a quiet man who worked hard and loved deeply and carried weight no one else could see. Today we say goodbye to Martin Weber, builder, husband, father, grandfather, survivor. And tomorrow we wake up and try to live the way he lived, with kindness, with courage, with the memory that sometimes the most important thing we do is save one life. And sometimes the most important thing we do is let ourselves be saved. The service ended. The mourners filed past the casket, paid their respects, went back to their lives. But in a small church in Hamburg, a story ended that had begun in Missouri 48 years earlier. A story about a punctured lung and 3 strips of bacon. About a cowboy and a doctor and a horse named Dusty. About discovering that America wasn't what the propaganda said. About learning that enemies were just people. About surviving when you shouldn't have. And about carrying that survival forward as a gift to everyone who came after. Martin Weber was buried in Ohlsdorf Cemetery. The headstone was simple. His name, his dates, and one line in English that David insisted on. Everyone matters, 3 words, Buck's words, the lesson Martin had carried from Missouri to Hamburg, from war to peace, from enemy to friend, from boy to man, 3 words that meant everything. Years later, Martin's granddaughter found the cowboy hat in a trunk, old, worn, mysterious. She asked David what it was. He told her about Texas, about a guard named Buck who treated prisoners like human beings, about a gift given across enemy lines, about legacy. She tried it on. Too big, but she wore it anyway. Walked around the house pretending to be a cowboy. Her grandmother Ingrid watched and smiled. She had never fully understood Martin's connection to America, but she understood that it mattered, that it had shaped him, that it had made him who he was. And in that moment in a Hamburg apartment 70 years after the war ended, the legacy continued. Stories passed down, lessons remembered. The simple truth that Buck Anderson had spoken on a farm in Missouri. Everyone matters, son. That's the whole point. Martin Weber learned that lesson, carried it, lived it, and passed it on. That was his victory, not surviving the war, but surviving it with his humanity intact. With the capacity to see enemies as people, with gratitude for those who saved him, with humility about his own story. He never considered himself a hero. Heroes did extraordinary things. Martin had simply done what was necessary, survived, rebuilt, loved his family, worked hard, treated people with dignity, remembered those who showed him kindness. But maybe that's what heroism really is. Not grand gestures, just small acts of humanity repeated over a lifetime. Just refusing to let bitterness win. Just teaching the next generation that kindness is stronger than hate, that people matter more than politics, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply remember. In 2010, David Morrison Weber's daughter, Anna Weber, wrote her doctoral dissertation on German prisoners of war in American camps. She interviewed dozens of survivors, read thousands of pages of records, and she uncovered her grandfather's story, the full story, the one he had never told. She found Morrison's letters, found military records of Martin's treatment, found documentation of Barracks 14 and Sergeant Krause, found records of Buck Anderson's service, found photographs of the Missouri camp. She wrote about it all, published it as a book, dedicated it to Martin Weber and James Morrison, two men who proved that even in war, humanity survives. The book sold modestly, a few thousand copies. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the people who needed to read it, veterans who recognized their own stories, families who learned secrets their grandfathers had kept, young people who discovered that history is more complicated than heroes and villains. And in Texas and San Antonio, a man named James Anderson read the book and recognized his grandfather's name, Buck Anderson, the cowboy who shared Coca-Cola with a German boy, the guard who taught an enemy to ride. James contacted Anna. They met in Hamburg, stood together at Martin's grave. Two grandchildren of men who had been on opposite sides of history but had found common ground in kindness. James brought something with him, a photograph, yellowed, creased, but still clear. It showed Buck Anderson standing next to a young man on horseback. The young man was thin, pale, but smiling, really smiling, like he had discovered something worth living for. "That's your grandfather, isn't it?" Anna looked at the photograph, at Martin's face, at an expression she had never seen in family photos. Not haunted, not carrying weight, just happy, free, alive. "Yes, that's him. Grandpa Buck kept this photo his whole life. He told my father stories about the German prisoners, about teaching them to ride, about sharing what little he had, about treating people like people. He said it was the most important work he ever did, more important than fighting, teaching enemies that they weren't enemies anymore." Anna held the photograph carefully, like it was sacred, like it was proof of something that mattered more than words could say. "Can I make a copy?" James smiled. "You can keep the original. I think your grandfather should have it back." They stood together in the cemetery, two strangers connected by history, by kindness passed down through generations, by the simple truth that what we do matters, that how we treat each other echoes forward through time. Anna added the photograph to the book's second edition. On the cover, Martin on Dusty, Buck beside them. Two men who should have been enemies, who chose friendship instead. The second edition sold better than the first, found its way into classrooms, into discussions about war and peace and what it means to be human when everything around you is inhumane. And somewhere in all of that, Martin's story became more than just his story. It became a reminder that kindness matters, that dignity matters, that seeing people as people matters, that everyone matters. That's the whole point. And that's the legacy Martin Weber left behind. Not medals or monuments, just a life lived with integrity. Just gratitude for those who saved him. Just passing on what he learned to anyone who would listen. 3 strips of bacon, 1 bottle of Coca-Cola, a horse named Dusty, a watch that kept time, a cowboy hat worn in private, letters exchanged for 30 years, a name passed to a son, a story finally told. That's how you win a war, not by destroying the enemy, but by discovering they were never really the enemy at all. Just people caught on the other side of history's mistakes. Just boys trying to survive. Just humans trying to make sense of a world gone mad. Martin Weber understood that. James Morrison understood that. Buck Anderson understood that. And because they understood it, because they lived it, because they passed it on, their legacy survived. Not in history books or monuments, but in quiet acts of kindness, in choosing to see humanity in unexpected places, in refusing to let hate win. That's the breath of freedom. Not just surviving, but surviving with your soul intact, with the capacity for gratitude, with memory that honors those who saved you by trying to save others in return. Martin Weber breathed that freedom, carried it from Missouri to Hamburg, lived it for 46 years, and when he died, he passed it on. Not to everyone, not to the world, just to his family, to his children, to anyone willing to listen to a story about bacon and cowboys and doctors who save enemies, because that's what doctors do. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. The story of Martin Weber, who survived a punctured lung, who learned that America was different than propaganda said, who discovered that enemies were just people, who carried that lesson home, who lived it quietly, who passed it on. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what matters. Everyone matters. Always has. Always will. That's the whole point.